Okay, and Pallavi, can you just nod to indicate that my screen is sharing okay? All right, so what I'm planning on going over with all of you today is very top level, very introductory and general. My understanding is that the part 2 and part 3 of this series may provide a deeper dive into certain grant opportunities and sponsors, but that this is really intended to kick off the subject. I've done 3-day long workshops on this subject. I've co-taught a semester-long course on this subject, and we have a year-long course that we teach at Penn State to research administration on this subject. But today I only have 6 slides, so we're keeping it as top level as possible to just provide a general overview of the grant and contract landscape and good things for senior graduate students and postdocs and the people who support them to know when they're trying to break into this important aspect of the academic life. So since my content is intentionally very limited, what I'm going to be asking all of the participants here to do is to be coming up with questions that you would like to discuss. I want to save significant time for talking to all of you after I'm done presenting these 6 slides. And I also encourage people to put a question in the chat or to interrupt me at any time with specific follow-up questions to anything that I mention. So if it's collaborative and conversational like that, hopefully it'll make for a better presentation and everyone will get more out of it that way. I've seen presentations like this at national and international conferences where the presenter spends half of the presentation talking about their own institution and how great it is. I'm not going to do that to all of you today, other than to mention that Penn State in fiscal year 2020 exceeded $1 billion in research expenditures. That means it's a large organization with a lot of different tendrils to it. And one of the negative consequences of that is people can feel lost in the system. They can be confused about where they should go, who they should talk to. They can feel like the system is supporting the superstars and not necessarily supporting people like a new assistant professor who just completed a postdoc and is now trying to figure out how to apply for their first grant. So one of the things that all of our institutions can do and that all of you can do in your roles is to try to make grants and contracts inviting and accessible so people can fight their way in and get a foothold in this world. The other point that I want to make about Penn State specifically is that we currently have over 1,150 active sponsors of different projects at Penn State. The reason why that's important is because every one of those has their own rules, their own expectations. Submitting proposals to a private foundation or to a federal agency or to an international organization or to a hospital, they all are going to have different terms and conditions and guidelines, expectations for what a proposal should look like and how the award should be administered. So this is something else that can make it overwhelming for people to break into this space. And so one thing that we also can do in supporting people who are trying to do this is to provide reassurance and resources so that they can figure out where to go with questions when they are trying to submit a compliant proposal or meet the needs and expectations of their sponsor on an active project. So what you see here on slide 1 is just, this is from our website, and most of the links that I'm showing you on our website at Penn State are publicly available in case you want to be either benchmarking for your own institution, or just looking for any good resources that you might want to steal. We're always happy in the university community to steal good ideas and resources from each other. So feel free to take anything that looks like it might be useful for you to integrate into the offerings at your own university. But what we do on our main sponsored programs website is we have these 5 tiles at the top of the page where you can drill down further into information about how to find funding, prepare proposals, enter into grants and contracts, issue subawards and subcontracts to collaborators at other institutions, and then manage the project once it's awarded. So what I'm doing for the remaining 5 slides is just drilling into each of those 5 in a little bit more detail. So the first thing is finding funding. And I've got some links here that you could look at to see how we organize this at our institution. Presumably, wherever you're working, they have similar resources available for searching for opportunities, finding places where you can be submitting competitive proposals. Some of the general advice that I would provide in this space is trying to avoid forcing a relationship that's not really going to work. So what we do see is investigators who are doing brilliant research, and they know they're doing brilliant research, so they expect sponsors to be falling all over themselves to fund them. And so they will go to maybe a private foundation and try to talk them into giving them money to support their great research. The problem, though, is if that's not specifically what that foundation wants to support, you can be as eloquent as you would like, and you're still going to have a really hard time convincing them to spend money on something that wasn't their intended objective. And it can be demoralizing if you know that you're doing really good work and you can't find an agency or a foundation that is willing to fund exactly what you're working on. And it does bother me on some level that we have to compromise our idealism to try to do things where there is money rather than do things that we think are going to have the greatest impact on the world. But there is some compromise that sometimes has to be made. I used to work for a professor who supported a very large lab with several postdocs and many graduate students. And so he wanted to be able to estimate how much money he would be bringing in to be able to support that operation so that he didn't have to lay anybody off. And so what he asked me to do is to put a percent of likelihood on each of the pending proposals. So at any given time, he would be submitting so many proposals, 10 proposals, 15 proposals a year. But the way that he estimated the likelihood of getting funded was by saying, if it was a cold proposal, where your application is just going to be in a big pile with 199 other applications, all competing for the same funding, then his estimate is that you had a 1 in 10 chance of getting that proposal funded. And that can be hard to hear, is that many proposals might only have a 10% chance of getting funded. But what he also said is, if he had done legwork with a sponsor, if he had talked to the program officer and interacted with them, and had conversations about what he was interested in doing and what the sponsor was specifically looking to support, and had opportunities to customize what he was doing to really match with the sponsor's interest, then his estimate for likelihood of funding increased from 10% to 40%. So it really, in his opinion, it was really important to look for opportunities to do that. And you need to do it in an honest way. You don't want to be getting insider information that isn't publicly available. But if there are public forums and other open opportunities to talk to sponsor personnel, ask questions, and discuss your research with them, you can really get closer to being able to find a sponsor that's a good fit for you and that may be willing to support your work. And then the third category of proposals from this professor where he was doing follow-on work, where he had already done a project for a sponsor and had delivered, hopefully, an excellent product to that sponsor, convincing them that he was a reliable person for them to support, and that if he went back to them with an idea to further extend that project and have more, better, greater outcomes from that project, then his estimate is that you had a 90% chance of getting that funded. And that is something that's a little difficult for like a postdoc or a graduate student who's looking for assistant professorships to hear, because you don't just enter the university with that background, with those pre-established relationships and a track record of success. Because of that, another really good strategy when you're talking to early stage academics is to not be so proud as to have to be the PI on everything that you submit. That if you can find a good funding opportunity and then talk to an experienced PI who has that track record, has those established relationships, and then you need to give that PI a legitimate role. It's not honest to put somebody's name on a proposal where they're not really doing any work just because you want the prestige of their name. But if they can have a real role on the project, even though you're writing the bulk of the proposal and you're doing the bulk of the work, you can increase your chances of getting funded, and then go back to that sponsor in the future and have that track record and use that to increase your chances of being able to secure funding in the future. So I realize some of this may seem obvious, especially because I know some of you have a successful track record of pursuing funding. But I'm trying to talk about this in terms of how you can mentor junior faculty and postdocs who are looking to enter into a tenure track position somewhere. Is they need to be thinking about how do you break into this area where there are billions of dollars that can support the research, but they have to figure out how to get it. And there's some path dependence where the money tends to go to the people who have already received money. And so being a newcomer is always challenging, and you need to think about strategies for getting in there. So the next stage of this is you've identified a good opportunity. Now, how do you submit that proposal? One thing I'm saying on this slide, which is maybe a bit pedantic, but so many people have made this mistake and really suffered for it, is they find a funding opportunity somewhere and then they prepare a proposal, they pour their heart into it, and they submit it. And either the sponsor rejects it or it gets funded and the university won't accept it because it wasn't processed through proper channels. So emphasizing this every chance that you can, that nobody should be going and submitting these proposals on their own. They need to be submitted through an office, like an office of sponsored programs or an office of sponsored research, or however your organization is organized. They need to be submitted through official channels. And there are some really good reasons for that. One of the reasons is because you have to apply correct rates to what you're submitting. And there are fringe benefit rates, there are indirect cost rates, there are other rates that may need to be used in a proposal. And if you submit your proposal without incorporating those rates, your institution may not accept the award, and all your hard work may be for naught. Another reason why they have to go through an institutional portal is because many proposals require representations or certifications of certain things. For example, NIH, one of the biggest US sponsors out there, just recently, in the last year, established a new rule that if you have somebody on your NIH project who is accused of sexual harassment, that during the investigation, if they're put on administrative leave, you have to tell NIH that they've been put on administrative leave pending that investigation. We didn't previously do that. We previously waited until an investigation was complete before telling the sponsor the outcome of the investigation. But now we have to certify that we will follow NIH's rules, which means letting them know if somebody is put on administrative leave. They haven't been found guilty of anything yet, but it's pending an investigation. We have to tell them that. The PI cannot themselves make that certification. The institution has to make that commitment to tell NIH things like that. And that's why NIH won't accept a proposal from an individual. They have to accept it from an institution. So please do emphasize that point, that they do have to go through a certain process to make sure the budgeting's been done correctly. Some proposals are enormously complicated. There can be proposals that are hundreds of pages long, filled with forms, filled with legal terms and conditions where you have to commit to contractual provisions at the proposal stage. So your institution has to be committed to them at that stage. So there's a lot of different things like that that need to be done. Some proposals are pretty easy and can be turned around in an hour or two, and other proposals can take weeks to do. DARPA, for example, is a sponsor that has tremendously demanding requirements, and you can't submit a DARPA proposal in a day or probably even a week. It's just a big lift to do everything that you need to submit a proposal like that. So you also want to give your proposal office, whatever it's called at your institution, plenty of lead time so they can partner with you in meeting all of those requirements. Some of the other errors that I have mentioned here, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but broader impacts, the third last bullet there, that's an NSF term, but a lot of agencies have something similar that they look at, which is a broader impacts in NSF's context means that they're not just interested in funding something that has intellectual merit, that has interesting science. They also want to see how is your project going to benefit the world. So does your project have a component where you're going into high schools to talk about science and encourage people to enter STEM fields? Does your project have a way of targeting inclusion of underrepresented minorities? There are a number of different things that you can do to show the positive social value of your project above and beyond the intellectual merit of whatever it is that you're doing in your science or your project. So that's something that you can do that can significantly increase the competitiveness of your proposals. The last two bullets there, overpromising and under budgeting. I suppose you also could under promise and you could over budget. But the reason why I'm picking on these two issues is because it's a temptation of people who are new to pursuing grants and contracts to promise the sun and the moon in a proposal. And the hope is that if you tell the sponsor that your project can do all of these different things, you'll increase the likelihood that you will get funded. That's the hope. But what are you going to do if they fund you? How are you going to meet all of those promises? And it can end up coming back to hurt your credibility and your ability to secure funding in the future if you overpromise what it is that you can actually deliver in, say, an 18-month grant period. You have to be realistic about what you can really do and not overpromise. Another thing that can happen with overpromising, we've seen projects before where investigators have gone to the U.S. Department of Defense because they have so much money. And so people go to the Department of Defense and they ask for some of that sweet money, and they start talking in a very imaginative way about how their research could benefit the warfighter or some other military technology. And they may be talking about something that's really quite speculative. Maybe 40 years from now, it's going to have a lot of benefit to the Department of Defense, but it doesn't have that benefit yet. And so then they get the project back from the U.S. Department of Defense, and it has a publication restriction on it or a foreign national restriction on it. And now your institution might not be willing to accept it because you can't do good academic work if you can't publish your research results and you can't employ, say, foreign graduate students on the project. So you were too successful at convincing the Department of Defense that there were military implications to your work, and now they've slapped contractual provisions that make it possibly impossible for you to do the work as so contracted. So be realistic about what you promise. And then the other thing about under budgeting is if you try to submit the low bid and say that you can do something for $75,000 and it's really going to cost you $150,000 to do it, you'll be in an awkward situation as a junior faculty member, going to your department head and begging for money to be able to finish your deliverables. You don't want to be in that position and burn your credibility with a department head or a dean when you're still trying to secure tenure somewhere. So when you're talking to postdocs and graduate students who are looking for tenure track positions, you have to make sure that even though they think they can increase your chance of getting funded by submitting really low, lean budgets, they don't want to be in a position where they don't have enough money to do the work. And then if that money doesn't materialize, if the department head won't give you additional money, then you end up under delivering, and again you alienated a sponsor, and that's no way of getting to the 40% or the 90% hit rates when you end up underperforming on a project because you promised too much and you budgeted too little. Does anyone want to ask any questions just yet before I go on to the next stage here?
I have a question, John. So my name is Brianna Connick. I am at the University of Chicago, and just kind of interested because there's kind of more and more opportunities for staff like us to actually start applying to grant and other types of funding mechanisms to support the types of career and professional development programs that we do. In your experience, is that something that you have worked with? Would we be expected to go through the same processing channels as you just kind of talked through?
The answer at our institution is yes. If you were going to, for example, a federal agency, very few federal agencies would accept a proposal from an individual because they do want to see those institutional commitments to abide by their terms and conditions. So because they want an institutional signature on the representations and certifications, you would most likely need to run through the same institutional structures as what I just mentioned. And also when it comes to applicability of rates, fringes and indirects and other such rates, you also would want to be working with somebody to help you develop a compliant budget. I see also a hand raised from Katie.
Hello, yes, I'm Katie Homar from North Carolina State University. To piggyback off of Bree's question, what are some strategies you would recommend for staff like us to reach out to a university grants office, sponsored research office, or development office? How to build that relationship when we are staff? It sounds too like, John, you've worked very closely with Pallavi in working with postdocs and international trainees. So how would might we cultivate a similar relationship on our campuses with a research office or grants development office?
Yeah, so one avenue is through your leadership. So as it so happens, Pallavi and I both report to the same person at Penn State. And so we're in monthly staff meetings with each other, and she can hear what I'm struggling with and I can hear what she's struggling with. So that very naturally engenders communication channels. If you don't have that naturally, you can always just make a cold call to the office and schedule a time to discuss your interests and see how helpful they can be. But also you can ask for your leadership to reach out to their leadership and talk strategically about how your institute, your university wants to be supporting graduate education and postdoc professional development, and that there is an apparatus there to support that and make sure it is clear to that office that there is a good pathway for you to be able to do that kind of work.
Can I add something to that, John? So
Yeah, sure,
in
please.
my role here at Penn State, I can apply as a co-PI or PI for grants that do not involve extensive research. And that John actually had a role in framing that policy. And what that did is that I could, if I identified any small grants that I could do programming with, I could apply for it. But to find the channel and the compliant budget that John was mentioning, I did look around to see who would help me. And there is an office because I'm not a faculty who's associated with a department or a college, and many colleges have their own grants office to help their faculty and staff. But there is a unit within our institution which helps those who are creating interdisciplinary projects. So I could kind of sneak through that path, and they helped me create a compliant budget. They made sure that all the fringe rates and everything were there, and they submitted the proposal on my behalf. So the one way is to reach out or collaborate with faculty members who have a natural path of submitting, or to identify any such grants office that would support your submission and help you in preparation.
Okay, well, I appreciate their questions and also the input, Pallavi. And any other questions on this or other things? Please continue to just raise them as we go forward here. So if you've submitted a good competitive proposal and you brought in funding, then the next terrible thing that could happen to you is that your institution could tell you that they're not going to accept the award, and it can happen. We do absolutely everything that we can to avoid that situation. We know that in some cases, a faculty member may have worked for months on establishing a relationship and writing a competitive proposal. But there are things that certain sponsors might impose that could be really problematic. I already mentioned that we see contracts sometimes where a sponsor says, we want to give you this money to do this work, but we also want to control everything that you say about it, everything that you do. And so that runs afoul of a principle of academic freedom. And it can be hugely problematic. If a private company, for example, wants to give money to you, and they say, if you find something good about our product, then we want the whole world to know about it. But if you find anything critical or questionable or unsafe about our product, then we need to have the contractual right to squelch that so nobody ever finds out about those problems. From a university point of view, from an academic point of view, that's just terrible. And so you may have gone through all that work and have run into an issue like that. Foreign national restrictions can be similarly problematic. So one of the things that we do, especially with those units that are working with the types of sponsors that are more likely to impose those restrictions, is we try to inform them in the proposal itself of our intentions. Our intentions are to publish. We have a statement that we include on a lot of our proposals that makes clear that the university expects the work to be considered fundamental research. We have a large number of foreign national graduate students and postdocs at our institution that are working in our labs, and that our expectation is that we will be able to employ that talent on the project to fulfill the objectives of the project. So if you're being really transparent with your sponsor about your expectations, you may be able to avoid some of these unpleasant situations. There can be confidentiality clauses where a sponsor might say that they're going to be giving you trade secrets that need to be kept confidential for the rest of your life. And it's, one of the reasons why that is so hard for us is because a large percentage of the people working on our projects are graduate students and postdocs who may be around for a few years and then be leaving the institution. So if you're making a 20-year commitment of confidentiality, then how do you control people after they've left your institution? And they already know things that they learned in the course of the project. And now your graduate students may be going and working for the competitor of the sponsor that provided you with that confidential information. You don't want to be exposing your graduate students to harm where they may be getting sued post-graduation by your sponsor because they're being accused of having disclosed confidential information. So that's another issue that just in the interest of being conscientious has to be carefully balanced and sometimes discussed and debated with a potential sponsor. Every university is going to have its own intellectual property rights. So if a sponsor does come in and they say they want to own all of the outputs of a project, that could be problematic to your institution. And just the last example that I'm mentioning here is where a sponsor is expecting a certain outcome. They may say that they're not going to pay you unless things work out in a certain way. This is more common with contracts than with grants, but where they're hoping that you can guarantee a certain outcome. And generally speaking, we can't and shouldn't be promising a particular outcome, because if you're doing, for example, cutting edge research, how can you promise a certain outcome? And also, how can you promise a money back guarantee? Because as a nonprofit institution, where do you get the money from to give them that money back guarantee? If you have an unhappy sponsor and you have to give them money back, you have to raise tuition rates in order to come up with that money. Because you've already spent it. You've already done the work. They've told you they're dissatisfied. They want the money back. So it doesn't happen often that we do have to turn projects away. Something that people have to have a realistic expectation of is that some sponsors, private companies in particular, can be really challenging to work with, in large part because what they want isn't always the same as what we want. If they're trying to make their company more profitable and we're trying to generate academic papers and have broad public benefit to our research, there's not always a lot of intersection between what they want and what we want. So it can be hard work to make that work. Moving on to my second last slide here, there's also the stage that not every project will have this, but where you are receiving money from a sponsor and then you want to issue a subcontract to another organization as a collaborator. One of the reasons why we see this a lot is because many of our largest sponsors are impressed by having large multi-institutional collaborative projects. If you can bring the best person from University of Chicago and this great person from Penn State and also somebody from North Carolina State University, and they all have complementary expertise, you can say, you know, we've got the smartest, best team in the country right here, and they're all coming together to work on this project for you. That can significantly increase your chances of getting funding. But then you have to manage it. So if you get all of those subawards, if you propose it and you get funded, then somebody has to be the lead, and whoever is the lead has to issue contractual documents to the others so that they're delivering their work, and so that you can monitor how they're spending their money and how they're doing the work that they need to do. And this can be difficult. It's usually not too difficult, but it can be difficult because academics can argue with each other. And if you're getting in a fight with your colleague at the University of Chicago, then it can really become a problem with what are they spending their money on? Is it appropriate? Is it consistent with the terms and conditions? Are they delivering the research results to you in a timely way so that you can do what you need to do? Relationships that may have been high quality relationships can become frayed in the process of trying to make these things happen. The other thing that's also important about this, though, is you can't afford to be too loose or casual about your subcontracts, because there have been findings at several major universities, not Penn State, thankfully, but at some other universities, and I won't name names, but it's all publicly available, where the government has determined that those universities did inadequate subrecipient monitoring. That's the way they refer to it. And so what can happen is you might have two people who went to graduate school together, and then one of them went to Penn State and one of them went to Chicago, and they're submitting proposals and putting each other on as subrecipients on each other's proposals so that they can be helping each other secure funding. And then you get a project funded, and say you're at Penn State and your buddy, your former friend from graduate student, sends you an invoice for $22,000 for the work that they did under the subaward. And you're like, whoa, this is my friend. I've known this person for 15 years. And you just rubber stamp the invoice and pay it. If the government finds that you're not paying attention and realizing that this is the US government's money, not your money, and it needs to be spent responsibly. So just because they're your friend and you went to graduate school with them doesn't mean that it's okay to just pass the invoices through and pay them without scrutiny. You really do need to take that responsibility seriously when you're managing a subcontract relationship. My last slide before we turn to general questions is now you have your award, and so this is a time for pie and confetti. You've got your $1 million multi-year grant, and so you're going to be golden for the foreseeable future. There are so many things that can go wrong, and the point of talking about them is not to be negative or scare anybody away. Just you don't want to see somebody who is new to the game of grantsmanship blow it all and then find themselves ineligible to secure such funding in the future. And so it's just good to know what the potential pitfalls are. Obviously, if you're not paying attention to your project, you're not paying attention to the terms and conditions, you could get in big trouble with a sponsor. The second bullet I want to emphasize is that when doing research, unexpected things happen and unexpected opportunities arise. If you have an R01, the most common instrument from the NIH, and it's a 5-year grant, it's very likely that in year 3 or 4 of the project, there's going to be a technology available that wasn't even in existence at the time that you wrote the proposal. Or there's going to be new papers that have come out that lead you in a new direction. And for an NIH grant, that is probably okay. For a lot of grants, the sponsor expects you to chase the science. So as long as you're still doing work on whatever topic that you proposed and that was reviewed by peer review, and you are giving regular updates to your sponsor in your progress reports that you would have to submit to the NIH, you probably are fine with doing that. But some sponsors are not going to be fine with you chasing the science. They're not going to be okay with it, especially if it is a contract instead of a grant. Then they are contracting for a specific set of deliverables. And we've had investigators before who they spend all the money, but they don't deliver what they promised because they thought it would be exciting and interesting to spend the money on something else instead. They lost interest in what they had secured funding for. And you can get sponsors very unhappy with you. If you want to negotiate a change to your scope of work, you have to go back to the sponsor and say, I have an opportunity to do something for you now that is even better than what I originally promised. And then there should be a formal modification to your contract if they agree to the change, saying we originally supported the funding of X, but now we're changing X to X prime, and you're going to be doing X prime instead. And that is officially approved. You're not doing anything fraudulent or inappropriate by redirecting the research in that manner. But it needs to be very transparent when research evolves that way. The third bullet is also something that has seriously damaged careers. And from the perspective of a new faculty member, say a postdoc who is just entering a tenure track position for the first time, it might seem difficult to imagine this because they're struggling just to get their first grant. But if they get good at it, now they have 2 or 3 or 5 grants. And they start to feel like, I'm a genius. Everybody wants to give me money. And all 5 of these grants are to support my diabetes research. So they start spending their money without regard to the specific scope of work that they submitted to that sponsor. They start charging costs to where they have the most money. They start charging costs to whichever project is expiring first. And that's wrong. That's fraud. Each project has a discrete scope of work. You can't be securing funding to be doing duplicative work. You can't be getting paid twice for painting the same bridge. So you do need to be keeping your projects separate lab notebooks, separate accounting, and then you charge costs to the project for which that cost is defensibly allocable. I know I just descended into some technical jargon there, but it should be pretty straightforward that if you're charging a piece of equipment or supplies or effort to a particular project, it has to be in support of the approved scope of work for that project, not just where it's administratively convenient for you to charge that cost. High quality data management is also important. Not being late with your reports and your deliverables is something that is shocking to me, how many hundreds of investigators we see every year who miss their due dates, and we get angry emails from sponsors. The federal government has something called the GONE Act. And so federal agencies have to report your institution to Congress if they aren't able to close out projects because they haven't received final reports. And you don't want your institution getting reported to Congress for noncompliance. Congress doesn't need any more excuses to distrust the academic community and think that we're taking their money without doing anything for it. So it is very important if you've made a promise, even if you've overextended yourself and you're overwhelmed, is to get your report submitted on time. And that is my final slide. I'll move to slide 1 for a background visual, or I can just stop sharing for now, actually. So maybe I can see a few more faces and we can spend our remaining time just talking generally about anything anyone would like to discuss.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. Feel free to ask a question, unmute and ask, or type in the chat, and I'm moderating the chat here.
Amy has a hand up.
Hi, thanks so much for sharing this information with us today. My name is Amy Klobes. I'm at the University of Virginia in our School of Engineering. My question for you is in relation to getting to know your grant organization. So for example, I'm thinking of the National Science Foundation, and there's often a program officer that works with the different requests for proposals. And what I hear from some of my faculty is that, you know, they know their program officer well and they have conversations and that sort of thing. And as somebody who hasn't necessarily established a relationship or had one of these grants yet, is there a way that you would recommend approaching someone like a program officer? You know, what is the appropriate way to establish that relationship that might actually help lead to a better understanding of a request for proposals and that sort of thing?
So to answer it in general terms is maybe a little bit hard, but they do sometimes have public forums. They will often have email addresses where you can send questions during the solicitation or RFP stage. But sometimes just if you really don't have anyone who can make introductions for you, so again, to sort of go back to a previous thing I said, if you have academic leadership that can make introductions for you, that can be really nice. If you've got, for example, an associate dean or a vice president for research or somebody who really knows this NSF directorate really well, and they can introduce you, that the familiarity can be beneficial. But if you don't have anyone at your institution who can open doors for you, what seems to be effective is calling with a question. And the question can be pretty specific, but then you can follow up by saying, you know, if there would ever be a good time to maybe chat on the phone about this in a little more depth, I'd love to have the opportunity to talk to you. And then it kind of depends on the personalities of the individuals involved, how willing they are to make themselves available to have those conversations. You know, being in Virginia gives you an advantage over the people in Chicago because you're not far from DC, and if and when you're comfortable to do in-person visits, what everybody says is if you can actually see somebody, shake their hand, and have conversations with them about some exciting idea of yours. It's not that they're going to be giving you inside information that's inappropriate. They should know what the boundaries are, what they can and can't share with you. But they know a lot. They know a lot, and they can you know, probably give you some really good advice on what to include and what to avoid when putting together a competitive proposal.
Thanks, that's really great advice. I appreciate your input.
Sure, thanks.
John, there's a question in the chat from Sonali. Could you speak, sorry, it just disappeared for me.
Yeah, I see.
Okay.
So Sonali, no, it's not completely binary, but it's become increasingly complicated, and it makes me sad that it's as complicated as it is, because until a few years ago, all we ever heard was the benefit and value of international collaboration, of bringing the best minds together from all around the world to work together to deal with questions of disease and climate and other things that cross borders. And so we pursued those international collaborations aggressively, and some universities built campuses in other countries and accepted honorary professorships at institutions in other countries. And now a lot of that is being questioned and scrutinized. This isn't really the right forum to go into depth into, you know, how this happened, but there are, I would just say there are multiple governments that have contributed to the problem, and there isn't a single party to blame for why this has become a more challenging thing than it once was. But the single best advice that we give all of the time at our institution on this is pursue international collaborations, continue to partner with the best people in the world. Don't stop doing that, but bend over backwards with being just as transparent as you can be about all of these. If you've made it completely clear that you're spending 6 weeks every summer going to this university in Germany and collaborating with this investigator on this project, which is related to the project that you're getting funded from NSF to support, and you put that in your NSF proposal, and you make it totally explicit, you are protecting yourself from accusations that you've concealed something. And that's what's going to hurt you. There are very few, and it's not that there are none. There are export control restrictions. There are sanctions. So there are certain things that you just can't do internationally. And if you're working in those technological areas, you probably are familiar with some of those controls and restrictions. But for a lot of research, it's not that the collaborations are illegal. It's just that they haven't been made transparent. They haven't been disclosed. They haven't been disclosed for conflict of interest purposes. They haven't been disclosed to your sponsors in your proposals. So if you have these international collaborations, just disclose in every way that you can. And then if you have a sponsor that has a problem with one of your relationships, it's a conversation then. Which relationship is more important to you? We have had some researchers who've had to make difficult decisions. We had a researcher who resigned a dual appointment in another country so that they would be eligible for certain money in the US. And those are tough decisions, but sometimes you have to be willing to face those. So hopefully, Sonali, that was along the lines of what you were looking for.
Katie asked a question on networking in the current climate in post-pandemic world. So what would be a virtual equivalent of that?
I don't know that there's much I can say other than sharing your video when you're on Zoom with somebody, especially if you want their money. Let them see you. Let them see something of your personality. Give them an opportunity to see your nonverbals, because then they can see your enthusiasm, and they can see you, leaning forward into the camera to talk about how excited you are about your research. And that's kind of the best that you can do if either because of pandemic restrictions or because you can't realistically travel to DC to meet a program officer. You can also sometimes, to go back a question or two, you can sometimes invite program officers to your campus. And especially if they're getting an invitation from like a provost or a vice president for research, you can have, an NSF day at your campus where you've got people coming and talking about exciting new opportunities. So sometimes you can get them to come to you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one question. And if you're hopping off, here is the feedback form that I'll be putting in the chat. Please complete it. It helps us kind of get an insight on what your thoughts are. But I think we have time for one question. Okay, maybe. Okay, well, I think we hit our time. Thank you so much, John. This was extremely helpful, and it provided a great segue to our future webinars, but also gave us a chance to think about grants and what role we can play as career development, professional development practitioners. There are some small pots of money that we can aspire to bring home, and to just know what this entails in terms of compliance, in terms of budgeting, in terms of collaborations is extremely helpful. Thank you. This was very helpful. Thanks, John. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Inviting me to join you all.
Yeah, thanks.
Have a great afternoon and late morning.
Yeah, thank you. This is great, John. Let me stop recording.